One of the big challenges coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic is related to Australia's population and how we open up our international borders. Obviously, when COVID first hit, what we did was we shut down migration, we shut down our international borders for good reasons to keep the virus at bay. That had challenges for Australian businesses that relied on international labour, whether that be unskilled labour like picking fruit, semi-skilled labour like in our hospitality industry, right through to really technical areas such as cybersecurity and auditors and a whole range of other professional services particularly. Now, in the short term, we're going to open up our international borders and hopefully that will restore some normality, or there's a perception of normality will come back to our labour market. But this issue of opening up the borders and our population, I think, has both a really longer term impact that we need to appreciate and a shorter term impact. The longer term impact is that even though we open up our international borders, because we have closed the borders for a number of years, Australia will be smaller than we expected it to be prior to the pandemic. In fact, by 2030-31, the projections are that Australia will have 1.1 million fewer people than we would have expected in the beginning of 2020. That's about 4% fewer people in Australia than we would have expected. That's just a little bit smaller than the size of Adelaide. Now, 4% might not sound a lot to you, but in fact, that 4% in Sydney and Melbourne is more likely to be 6%. And that's because more migrants go to Sydney and Melbourne than anywhere else. So if you're a business that had been relying on population growth to underpin your sales, then that might be a really significant number, taking 6% of the growth off. Now, what businesses is that a particular issue for? Well, in fact, it's a lot of businesses. About 40% of Australia's GDP growth in recent years has come not because we are more productive, but in fact, just because we are bigger. So what this means is the economy as a whole is going to be slower. And for businesses that have relied on selling to people just because there's more of them, that's a particular challenge. Now, what businesses are they? Well, in fact, it's a lot. For example, mobile phones, houses, they're obvious ones where you don't need more than one of. So the population is going to be a particular driver of that activity. The more people there are, the more of those things. But in fact, it just goes down to many items that are everyday items for us. It might be clothing, it might be food. So businesses in Sydney and Melbourne particularly, losing about 6% of your headline growth could be a real game changer at the margins. And I think that will disrupt some businesses. Maybe the challenge here is, have you actually been planning for that growth already, or do you just wing it and hoping it would be there? But that's a medium-term challenge that I'm pretty sure businesses have. In the shorter term, I think the real challenge will be the opening up of the international borders. A lot of people have assumed that opening the borders just means we'll be back to normal and things will be smooth. I suggest that, in fact, things are going to be quite disrupted for the next 18 months, if not longer. Opening up the international borders is going to have a couple of challenges. One is, even though we open the borders, it'll take some time for international capacity in the aviation sector to ramp up. A lot of airlines have obviously mothballed planes. It takes a long time for those to get back. It's not clear that we're going to get back super quick. Also, the people leaving Australia are not going to be the same as the people coming into Australia from a skills perspective. I'd suggest we're going to see a lot of people coming in who are international students initially. They provide employment labour opportunities for some businesses, but not for most. But the people leaving Australia is going to be, we believe, significant. Every survey of the population shows that there is an incredible pent-up demand. There's almost a cultural ethos in Australia of that big overseas trip or that gap year or the travel the world. And we've seen that in every survey. That pent-up demand is just waiting to go. And on top of that, I think there's a real risk that we're going to see people who are tired after the last couple of years of COVID, either emotionally because they've been in lockdown, emotionally because they've been working incredibly hard, particularly if you're in the health sector, some areas of government, but a whole range of industries have extra pressure and a stress has been put on through COVID. So what we see, I think, from a board perspective is there's a couple of challenges. Asking your management, do we actually plan out over the next decade? And have we effectively relied on population growth to underpin a lot of our revenue growth? If that's the case, and you're particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, but as a general proposition, are we at risk in that planning of not capturing that Australia is going to be smaller? But I think there's more immediate challenges for the board, and that is around the mental health of the organisation. Is there an understanding of the degree to which staff are feeling comfortable or burnt out? And active management of leave over the next, let's say, year, I think is going to be a real challenge for organisations trying to meet the demands or the desires of staff to take that leave, but equally being cognizant that that is going to be potentially more disruptive than normal from a workforce perspective. So population challenges for Australia are both the long term and I'd suggest very much the short term as well.